another is concentrates. These are oats. I've also got some corn, and we'll talk about how this actually works as we move through the system. When we're starting to talk about the horse, there's no use in just kind of beating around it, because if you've had horses before, or if you've done any type of research to figure out if you want to have horses, you'll know that God gifted them with two different types of systems. One designed kind of like humans and pigs, and one designed like ruminants, except he gave them the worst attributes of both systems. So you can find out why it's always a struggle for them to be able to find ways to stay healthy and to be able to stay well-fed or underfed or whatever that may be, keeping them away from the vet with colic or anything else. But we'll start through the system. So the first part of the system is very similar to the human side. It functions very similar. That's the reason why we can eat corn and they can eat corn. They get a little more value out of it, but it's the reason why we both can eat corn. So it starts with food is ingested into the horse's mouth. And so that's the first time that we can actually have action taken by the horse. So the horse is there's going to be two different things that are occurring. One is there's the physical chewing of the feed stuff, whatever that may be. It could be hay, it could be oats. So we're either, no matter what, we're trying to grind down and make that ingestion a little bit smaller. Makes it a little bit easier to digest down the way. So it might be smashing these oats down just a little bit so that when they go further down into the system, it's a little bit easier for different chemicals or different enzymes to be able to attack them and turn it into something we can use. And here it might be grinding it up into smaller bits and pieces so that it passes through the system a little bit easier. But that's why it's very key is to check your horse's teeth on a regular basis, because we need that function. For one is you don't want horses to just continue to drop feed out of their mouth, and you don't want them to be able to not chew on one side. You need to actually be able to evenly chew this so that we take that first action. Because if you miss that first action and they're just swallowing things start to build up. You can see we've got that's how far from point A to point B all the way down there. It has to work down there through them. So when you start taking and changing the way the physical structures of things, or lack thereof of change, you can cause issues on down the way. So the first thing is we got to have good teeth to be able to work that way, change the physical structure of whatever they're eating. The next part is they're actually producing some type of like salivary, what we call amylase, which is another product used to help break down different feed stuff. So that is produced. Then the other part is we are starting to, when the horses actually start eating, that is then triggering the release of saliva, which is then used to help move the feed product on down the system, and then also moves into the stomach, which we'll get into next. But if the horse is not eating, the horse is not producing saliva. If the horse is not producing saliva, we'll see what happens on down the road here. So it's very key to be able to keep that on a constant basis, that we're wanting them to be breaking down the feed stuff, being able to produce that amylase, which is a chemical that helps start breaking down that product, and then producing that saliva that's going to be a buffer on down the line. Anybody have any questions on the mouth? All right. So that's the easiest part. So they have a good mouth, okay? So we'll work down. We're going to work through our esophagus.
Does young horses have much teeth problem? Or just mainly older?
Typically, it would be the older ones. That you're starting to lose some of those teeth, and so they're not aligned, so they're not getting the proper grinding of it. Not typically do we have any younger horses. So about 3 to 4 feet, we move down the esophagus to the point we start to come to the next part, which is the stomach. So as the stomach, it enters the stomach, and this is what we call a valve. So it's the cardiac valve. It's not important to remember, other than the fact that in humans, the cardiac valve, flows back and forth. So when something flows in, if something disagrees, that valve can flow back the other way. Stuff can come back out, right at the end to vomit. Well, this one, they have a very, very tight cardiac valve that does not allow it to flow. And I'm sure you guys have heard horses can't throw them. They can. It's not good when they do because they're not supposed to be. So it's got a very, very tight valve right here, which means if something goes wrong, in humans, if something goes wrong right here, it's got to go a couple feet in it out the system. Well, in horses, if something goes wrong right here, it's got to go 90 feet that way. And so what all can happen in 90 feet going that way? And so that's an issue why, you could have all the different issues with colic, which colic is a very, very general term for a stomach ache. So there's a million reasons why we colic, but that's why we have issues. This valve does not flow back and forth like it does in humans. So strike one, to the horse, and one point for the humans on that. Next, so we have the stomach. Ingestion comes in here from the mouth, down the esophagus, comes into the stomach. It's going to sit in here for roughly 15 minutes, give or take what it may be. Maybe if it's in forages, it may be a little bit longer. The quality of the forage will determine if it's any longer than that. Grains and concentrates, 15 minutes. Not much is occurring as far as digestion. Okay, what's being occurring is, so the horse has a stomach, and it's broken up into two portions. It's got the top portion and the bottom portion. The top portion, there's not a lot of protection to the mucosal layer of the stomach. Okay, the bottom portion, where the ingestion comes in, flows in, drops down to the bottom, this is where the hydrochloric acid, HCl, hydrochloric acid, starts to take effect down here. So it flows down in here. You start to get a little action on whatever they're ingesting starts to occur right down in here. As they start to eat it, it also produces what we call pepsin, another thing to help start breaking down some of those products to get it ready for ingestion right down here. So it's just kind of a prep zone. But that hydrochloric acid is very important right in here. Now, here is another, strike two to the horse when it comes to this. When we are just standing here, we're not producing HCl, because we don't have food. If we were to see food and be really hungry, it would start, somebody's grilling burgers over there, it would start to trigger our body to start producing HCl because we are going to plan on eating. So our body's getting itself ready. Horses, 24/7, are producing hydrochloric acid. Whether there's something coming in there or not, they're producing it. Which means if you don't have anything there, you just have a vat of hydrochloric acid sitting in here. Once again, that's why we go back to the mouth. That stimulation, that chewing, is what stimulates saliva, right? Saliva is the buffer to hydrochloric acid. So that helps buffer and protect that. So we have this mucosal layer that helps protect the inside layer. And then we have this ingestion and the saliva coming down in here. And that's mixing with the hydrochloric acid and help diluting and help protecting this stomach. So when we're feeding meals, we obviously want to be feeding small meals all the time. Horses eat a lot of very small meals, but they also have to just constantly be eating something. If not, we sometimes like to feed them kind of like we would be, or your dog would be. You feed them a meal in the morning, a meal in the afternoon. And so what that does is it makes us feel good. They got a big healthy meal in the morning, they got a big healthy meal in the afternoon, and we feel like, okay, they're good to go. Well, that meal only, once they consumed it, that meal is only in here for a short period of time, so they're not producing any more saliva, they're not producing any more buffer, and so now their system has now got an overload of hydrochloric acid, and so it starts wearing on the stomach lining. And I'm sure you guys, and that's where we start to get into gastric ulcers. And that can come from a myriad of reasons. But one of the reasons that you'll start to see is, once we get these two layers, is trying to keep ingestion here all the time so we don't get splash effect. If you have a horse that eats a lot or does a lot of exercise, a high intensity exercise, you get, you kind of picture it doing like this. Stuff is splashing up. So you get this top layer that doesn't have as much protection. It's getting a splash up of hydrochloric acid. If you don't have any ingestion, it's just pure hydrochloric acid getting up there, and it's causing a layer. So you want to make sure that you have a quality food that they can actually be breaking down in their system. And so it doesn't mean you feed them right before. This is obviously just, if it's a hay or something, it might be in there a little bit longer. But you want to make sure that you have something in there so you don't get that splash. One of the issues that we also see is when you feed or you treat, so if you get an injury, you treat with bute, right? And so what bute does, it kind of stops prostaglandins release. You can pick or choose what you didn't remember that hormone. It doesn't really matter. It stops the release of a certain hormone, and that's what also reduces inflammatory and causes less pain for the horse. But what it also does is it makes it that prostaglandin also helps protect that mucosal layer. And so now, if you've taken away, when you start putting them on bute, you've taken away that hormone protecting this layer. So now this horse is susceptible. So it's even more important that we have a good quality meal, consistent meal in there to help reduce that hydrochloric acid action. And so invariably, what you'll see is, in order to stop that from happening, obviously we're scientists, and so we like to kind of play the chemistry game. Okay, if bute does this, I'm going to do what? I'm going to create another, medicine or something to counteract that. So what they do is they create ulcer guard or something very similar, and so they'll give them ulcer guard. Well, ulcer guard does help that. It does help create and protect that. But also, what does it do? It stops hydrochloric acid production. So it stops the production of the hydrochloric acid. Well, now we've got an issue because hydrochloric acid is important in what we do. It helps break down that material. So now our horse is not efficiently breaking down what's in its stomach. So now we're kind of in this vicious cycle of trying to work through what it is. And you're kind of just playing this chemistry game. You're going back and forth. Okay, do I give more bute, less bute? Do I give more ulcer guard? Whatever that is. And so the key part of all that is try to keep a good quality forage, small meals, forage being the key part of that. Try to keep a good quality meal inside of their stomach, and this will help protect a lot of things. So you can't be ultra protective. You can't prevent splash up of hydrochloric acid when they're doing intense exercise. You just can't prevent that. That's part of it. But what you can do is have that diluted out or have it acting on something. Continue to feed it with different types of saliva, and that helps it along its way. But very, very small, 2 to 4 gallons is all the size of the stomach it is. It is a pass-through organ, but there is important action that occurs. Even though not a majority of the action takes place in the stomach, as far as animals go, it has one of the smallest stomachs proportionally to its body than anything. It really does not use it to the degree at which humans or pigs would actually use their stomach. But this section still is what we would call, a monogastric animal, like a pig or like a human. So, any questions on the stomach? Okay, so it's important to maintain that. So when you're starting to feed, be cautious and be aware as feeding high quality things to keep this fed, keep this in right. So remember they are always producing hydrochloric acid. That's the biggest thing. They're always producing hydrochloric acid. So when you're feeding meals, be thinking about that. When you think about feeding a good meal, so let's say you have a pasture it's midsummer and it's a fescue pasture where it's just been worn down, and so you feed that a little bit of meal in the morning, a little bit of meal in the afternoon. Is making sure that you have a quality forage out there during the day for them to be consuming. Because if not, you can kind of picture now where they're at. Is once that stuff's worn off, if they're not consuming something, they're going through the action of trying to graze, but if they're not actually pulling in anything, they're not creating that saliva that goes down. They're not creating that buffer. They don't have ingestion in here to be able to help fight with the hydrochloric acid. So something to be aware of when you're starting to look for your pastures or whatever you're doing is how you set up your feed is making sure that they've got a quality forage of some sort coming through here. All right, so if we have no questions on the stomach, we're going to move on down. So once it leaves the stomach, it's going to head down this long path. It's about 70 feet long. It is the small intestine. So at this point, we are still in the human side of it, still functioning like a human. And so this is where we're starting to get a lot of the digestion of, if we're feeding any type of concentrate, this is where we get the action on it. As far as hay, this is more about the forage part of it. This is going to be passing through the system. So we're going to be passing through the system with the hay. This is not just the same as us. We don't digest hay, so neither will horses in this portion of the stomach. But this is where we start to get our concentrates starting to be broken down. Enzymes are going to start feeding in from our different organs. So between the liver, they're going to start in the pancreas. They're going to feed enzymes in here. If you went to high school chemistry and biology, enzymes attack proteins, and that's how then they make it so that we can actually utilize proteins in our body. Is they change the chemistry of it, and then they allow us to be able to use it. So they're starting to work on this corn. They're breaking it down. It's in here for roughly an hour or 2 to 3 hours. At best.
In the small intestine?
Small intestine. So, it's pretty variable. But it's starting to work down through here. It's getting a drop of it. One thing that's also produced is it produces bile. So bile, just like us, bile is triggered. It comes from a gallbladder. Horses do not have the gallbladder. It's strike-free. I don't know how many strikes they get, but it's strike-free. So they don't have the gallbladder producing, so they're always producing bile. But one of the really cool things about horses is there's usually a limit on how much fat you can feed an animal and how much you can get them to actually consume. So when you start talking about fat is energy, okay? Fat is a really concentrated form of energy, okay? So, you might be able to feed a jar of fat here that's equal to an entire drum over there of corn and get the same amount of energy. So, obviously we don't want them eating an entire drum of corn, but we would sure like to have some of that energy depending on the type of horse we have. But the cool thing about them is they can eat about up to 15% of their diet in fat. So if you're needing to put on weight on a horse, you've got, instead of trying to do it in a really energy dense thing or energy really high starch diet like corn, you can feed them a fat and get that energy to them. So most other animals, 5% is a lot to be able to get them consumed, because at some point it's going to be kind of greasy. You'll notice if you feed them a high fat diet, they're going to eat kind of really greasy manure, but at some point they won't consume it. So, but 15% is really high. It's one of the highest ones for those animals. So maybe we take away a strike or we add a tally in our favor. So they can consume a lot of that. So the bile is being dumped in there from the liver. But the small intestine is where we start to see the production of the enzymes. That's where they can start utilizing the corn, the soybean meal, anything else. We can't really utilize it that well. We don't utilize a lot of the nutrients that come from corn. We get a little bit of it. For the most part, it passes on. And if you were just to feed whole corn to horses, the same action would occur. That's why we don't feed whole shell corn to horses, because it has such a tough outer shell. They can't utilize it and break it down, so it just kind of shoots it all through. When you break it down and smash it up here or put it in omoline or something like that, they can use it a little bit better, because those enzymes, hydrochloric acid, start working on all the surface area of it when you start breaking it down. But, so it comes down here. So the key that occurs right here that runs us into a lot of trouble with horses is when we feed a large diet of concentrate, either that naughty pony that they got into the feed pack room, or we had somebody feed for a couple of days for us, and they fed, when we said 1 can, maybe they had a little small can, or you brought it, and they brought in their own big gulp can, whatever that may be. So they've ingested a ton of concentrate. So what happens is it passes through the stomach, gets to here, and some of it, they can only, it's on a timer, it's moving its way through there. Well, a lot of it may start working its way down here. I'll start moving down here a little bit. And it's moving so fast or so much that part of it doesn't get consumed. And that's it doesn't get all broken down. So what it does is it takes the next part of the animal, which is for us, it just moves its way out the system if we don't use it all, or it sits in our stomach. It feels like it's weighing down our stomach. For the horse, what happens is it's reached the end of the line. So the human side, the monogastric side, and now we're getting ready to transition into the ruminant side. And we call them a non-ruminant herbivore because they're not really a ruminant. They're not a ruminant, which would be like a cow or a sheep, goat. So they have four components to their stomach. So they're going to act, their system is going to kind of act like a ruminant, but without all the technology that comes with ruminants. So they're going to try to make do with what they have. So, long story short, corn comes down here. We ate too much of it. Some of it gets digested and absorbed here in the small intestine. Some of it escapes now into this next realm of the system. So we have this little junction. So the junction, so it's like, there's like, in the picture, there's a little T here, PVC T. Small intestine comes in here, it dumps down into what we call the cecum. Okay? Cecum is this just big blind sac. And so this is where all the hay and everything else starts to dump into. Okay? And so we now have this corn, which should have been digested along these 70 feet, some of it escaped down into this next system. So this system, and we'll come back to that. So this system, but I think it's important to understand how the system's designed to then understand why it's trouble that escapes. The system is kind of like the cow rumen. So it is like a fermentation vat. So this system right here is actually alive. This is a vat full of alive beings. Okay, microbes, we call them microbes. But these microbes are living in here. And really what you're doing is you're feeding them. And then in return, they're returning a product to the horse. So we have to make sure that we feed the microbes correctly so that they can then return a product to the horse. Because the horse is not actually using the grasses it's eating. It's actually feeding those microbes. So we have to make sure we feed them correctly, or they die off, and then we have a problem. So they come down in here, so they ingest it, all falls down in here. So they're designed primarily to be able to handle forage-based material. So when they eat hay or anything up here, pretty much everything is passed along to here. So the leaves, the stems, because that's all the cell wall. And that's what the microbes are eating, is the cell wall of those plants. So back to our corn. Our corn escapes. Our corn comes down here, dumps into our system here, and all of a sudden you've just shocked these microbes. Okay, this is something totally different. This is not something we're used to handling. And so we can handle it, but all of a sudden you shocked us, and now we're going to try to take it on and do it. Well, the same kind of goes for cattle as well, or any of the ruminants, is you can't just change the way they act. You can do it slowly because there's different microbes. So different ones will kind of take priority when you're trying to break down concentrates. And then other ones will take priority when you're trying to break down forages. Well, all of a sudden you have this forage system set up, and you just dump all this concentrate down into it. And what it does is it causes like death of the microbes. So that can produce lactic acid that can then, upon their death, lactic acid, and that lactic acid can then get released into the system, into the blood. And if anybody ever heard of laminitis, so sometimes that's what you get. So you get this laminitis, which is this kind of like a poison that is released from the death of these microbes, released into the blood. It goes down to the laminae, which is what kind of holds the coffin bone of the horse, kind of holds it flat. So it's got anchors at the front and the back that are trying to, the front that is trying to keep this level. And when that poison kind of hits there, it starts to kill and wear away that lamina that's holding this, and so you get a rotation down. The hook coffin bone rotates down. Of course, now it's putting pressure right there on the sole, and that's what's causing a lot of the issues because you've killed off the lamina, which has been done because it's not the same. I mean, it's not that way for every time. The reason why you have laminitis is not that way every time, but a lot of times it's because you've killed off some of the bacteria or the microbes inside of that cecum by transitioning the way they form. So there's other ways to kill them off, but that's occurring whenever you get a big overload of one type of concentrate moving down through the system. So ideally, we try not to ever feed any more than 4 to 5 pounds. Obviously, that is based on what we call an average size horse. You get a Clydesdale, they're going to eat a little bit more. You get in ponies, a lot less. Proportionally, 4 to 5 pounds. You don't want to feed any more than that in one meal. You start to get above that, that's when you start to get seepage out the system, and you start getting it going in places it's not going to. 4 to 5 pounds, it should be able to consume that in one meal. I should be able to break it down and be able to consume it and absorb it in the time before it gets here. So when we come to, so any questions on the small intestine? Is this helping to get a better perspective of how this system actually is working? And so when we start to incorporate different feeds or when to change different feeds, we can see how that might change. So,
Can I ask?
Absolutely.
So I have senior horses, and so I have to soak the feed. So when you're saying 4 to 5 pounds, if I do the scoop, which is 3 quarts, and weigh that, is it that dry weight or
Is that the concentrate or like a hay?
No, I'm talking about Pinnacle senior feed.
Okay, so typically we do it on the dry matter because we don't know what all the different ones, different feeds weigh, so they do it on the dry matter.
Okay.
Is what it would be based on. Yes.
What are the signs and symptoms of an ulcer?
You can get lots of things, and the problem is it masks itself as many things. One of them is just not eating. The lack thereof wanting to eat because that you have all that irritation to the stomach lining. You can get some seepage that can come back up into the esophagus. So that just a lack of desire to want to eat is a big one, but it's very difficult. And you have a very sensitive stomach, which means as we'll show it as we look at the blanket. Towards the end, you can see where you can feel in different portions where you're going to have sensitive stomachs to it.
They can get girthy.
The what?
They can get girthy.
Yeah.
Sorry, for lack of a better description.
Where can you get a scale that is sensitive enough to weigh just 4 to 5 pounds? Because I just try to do it on my scale at home that I use, and it didn't register.
A lot of the feed stores can carry some very simple bucket or like a hanging feed scale or some very very easy ones you can zero. They're almost just like a scale we use for us. So most feed stores and really anywhere you can measure it. It helps. You need to know what the kind of dry matter percentage of the feed it is. Most of them are going to be very, very dry. When we look at hay, hay is typically 88 to 90, 91% dry matter. So when we were figuring on it, we'd only figure 10% dry matter for something like hay. Ideally, if not, we'll get into spoilage. But that gets also into why we don't want to feed more moldy hay or moldy corn or anything like that. That can easily get absorbed in that small intestine and then put into the body system. So making sure that you have a a quality feed that is not moldy of any sort as we work through that system.
So it's about a couple hours through the small intestine.
Yeah, just depending on it, which one it is. Some of them move through in an hour, and some may take a little bit longer. Obviously, a lot of our feed stuff, they can be different. If you start to put different ones that are a little bit more exposed, like ground corn or something that has a lot of points that it can actually be working on, the enzymes can be working on, it's going to digest it a lot quicker. A little bit holler corn, a little bit rougher corn, it may take a while longer for it to digest. So as we start to go through here, yes.
Question. As far as like traveling or trail riding too, because you're talking about giving them forage the whole time.
Yep.
Often. What's your recommendation on, like for trail riding? You go out on the trail for an hour or two. They need to be eating some point in there to make sure they've got.
No, but you're probably going to have some natural, they're probably naturally going to, when they try to put their head down, things like that. I'm not saying when you're going for a trail ride, you need to make sure that every 15 minutes, every hour, you need to get off and graze them for an hour. You need to make sure that they have a quality forage in their stomach, because it's not realistic. So, there's plenty of times throughout the day when you don't see them eating all the time. It's just a general, and the concept is you need to make sure you have a quality forage. If you have a quality forage, it will sit in there for a little bit and be worked on. Grain moves through there really rapidly. A quality forage stays in there a little bit longer. So that's why they want you to base your diet completely. If you can start with a diet of forage and then supplement where you go from there, versus vice versa, which we get into. A lot of people is quality, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what feed we actually need from the feed store. We need to spend more time trying to figure out where can I get the highest quality hay for my horse. That doesn't mean that you get something that is like candy that is broken down really quickly. It needs to be really high, sky-high protein, but it means you have a quality forage that can be easily broken down. If you fed them straw, yes, that process gives them something longer to be working on, but nothing is occurring. Nothing occurs in the stomach, so it's just kind of sitting there. So you can get buildup of some straw if there's no way for it to actually be utilized, and then it can get stuck along the way. And actually, when it gets to the stomach, even then they can't always use all of that because it's just such a hard. It's like eating like a strong tree branch. It's really hard to work through a lot of that. So you need to have something that does have a cell wall that can be broken down. And now when I say going back to the stomach, backtracking a little bit, alfalfa can be a very good product, especially if you've got a horse working for more than one reason. But we're going to talk about it from the health of the stomach. It has a lot of properties of hay, but it's obviously pretty high in protein. It's not very high in starch, which corn concentrates are high in starch, which that's where they're broken down. So it's a quality feed. It's going to provide increased nutrient levels versus like a common grass hay. So you're going to increase the nutrient levels that you might be using the corn to supplement, or not necessarily corn, but the supplement concentrate seed to help mix, help raise up that nutrient need. You can supplement alfalfa in, and that then can provide a good buffer system for the stomach, especially if you have issues. If you have a horse that's very sensitive to gastric ulcers, that can be very helpful along the way. Yes? Yes. It is. They're not pulling anything off of it really.
Right.
There's no. I mean, you're filling a gap, you're filling this vat, but you're not getting as much out of it. So that you're going through the action of filling it up, but sometimes it can come in here, it just kind of sits there for longer. So it kind of fills them up, but it doesn't really provide the nutritional value that we need. But yes, they have the exact same system, not quite as compact and long.
Okay, yeah.
So that's why we don't necessarily see all the problems with colic and things like that on the donkey side. It's not quite as compact.
Also pellets, like alfalfa pellets or timothy pellets, do those go through the digestive system at the same speed as grain, or do they actually go slow?
It depends. So like when we start talking about some of those things,
Will you repeat that question?
the question was do pellets like alfalfa pellets go through the system just as quick like grain would? So part of that is you feed alfalfa pellets because, or feed cubes or beet pulp is because some of the teeth don't function. So we need to get that high fiber diet, which that's what we feed a forage for feeding a high fiber diet. We need to get that to them, and maybe they don't have the teeth to be able to handle grinding down this forage. So it's still going to pass it. It's going to pass through the system a little bit quicker to get here, but the action for the most part is still going to occur here because it's based on being fiber, which this is where the action has to occur, and what we call the cecum is where that action occurs for the fiber component. So the front part, even though it's smaller, it's smaller chunks, it looks kind of like concentrate. What's making that up is actually fiber and fiber components. So you get a little bit of action occurring in the small intestine, but most of the action is going to occur down here in the cecum. So as we move into, we move to the cecum, we've moved to this environment where our hay is at. Obviously, with a highly digestible feed, it's going to be here for less time, but a feed can be here for roughly 2 to 3 days. You get into the wheat barley, it may be here a lot longer. It's going to take a lot more action, and a lot of times it puts enough action into it. Finally, it just shoots it out, and it's done because it didn't get anything out of it. But for the most part, it's going to take 2 to 3 days. It's going to work its way through here. These microbes are working on it, and they're creating a product. Okay, basically they're going to create a product and ship it on down the line. They're going to ship it to this next section, what's going to be used there. So it's really key to keep this environment healthy. We're keeping these things alive. So does that mean that they can't handle grain? No, but it means that you shouldn't shift your horse's diet from really high percentage of forages to the next day. Okay, I'm going to start shifting to they're going to start training real intensely. So I'm going to start adding a whole bunch of concentrates to their diets, and all of a sudden you shift. It doesn't work that way. So you need to, if you're going to start to do that, you know that, hey, my horse is going to start training intensively in 2 weeks. I'm going to start slowly transitioning them, and they're going to need more concentrates to make up for that energy need. I'm going to start transitioning them by a little bit a day, a pound a day. Start transitioning them to that environment. So what that allow is allow this environment that's in the cecum start to transition itself. It will start introducing some other microbes to be able to handle the change in the environment. Okay, so whatever you do, you just don't want to do anything rapid with the horse. So make sure it's this very slow transition, a little bit at a time, and you can change that environment that's working in here.
So if you have your horses on a good quality grass hay, whether it's, I don't know if you call it fescue high quality, but
It is.
Timothy or something, and if you were going to start transition to give them some alfalfa, but you're keeping the grass hay, you're keeping them full fed, access 24 hours. Alfalfa wouldn't be that way, but is it too rich to kind of limit feed them on that?
It's another one thing. It's used really intensively. So if you have starved horses, that's what they recommend in feeding. If you feed, you'll feed starved horses a bunch of grain that, they consume a whole bunch of it, and all of a sudden it kills the other system. The alfalfa provides a lot of nutrients without necessarily as much as the issues with killing the rest of the system. So you don't have to transition it. I wouldn't all of a sudden go from a grass hay to alfalfa hay complete change the next day, but you don't have to worry nearly as much about that transition as you would from a concentrate to a grass.
Can you keep alfalfa though in front of them 24?
Yeah, you won't like the results probably. You know, like I said, it is nutrient rich. So for the most part, if you have a horse that is lightly trail riding to being a pasture ornament, a good quality fescue hay is all they need. You know, we don't want to believe that, but a good quality fescue hay is all they need to be able to maintain all the nutrients they need.
No matter the age, for older horses?
Yeah, age is relative. You can have a 15-year-old that has lost, you know, it's a hard keeper that has lost a lot of its teeth that needs beet pulp and other things to be able to maintain weight. You can have a 30-year-old that is still got all its teeth and maintains its weight really easy, just keeping them on that fescue diet. So really, you kind of have to, you're constantly evaluating the horse's body condition to be able to tell if that's dieting appropriate. And that's working with your vet, working with the company, whatever it is. But that's really important. And we'll cover next a couple of
Thursday.
weeks. We're going to cover pasture management. We'll cover geared towards you guys because Dr. Ivy and her team did a great job. But it's just more than you can handle in one night. So we'll try to add into some of that. And we'll talk about some of those different things along the way.
How do you start slowly incorporating the hay? For me, I get it from the co-op and I do mixed grass. And let's just say I did 1 plate of mixed grass. Could I then do 1 plate of mixed and 1 plate of the fescue?
You can keep the grass going as much as possible. You know, they may throw their nose up at it, so you may just do that because you may, even between, you know, first and second cutting on your own farm, you may see it, you know, where they don't like one and they kind of throw their nose up at it, where, you know, you can slowly mix them in together, or you can just say, hey, tough, deal with it, and they will start eating. But so there is that little bit of a personality issue that comes with it is, you know, I don't like this. Give me the other thing that you've been giving me all along the way. But there's no difference. You don't have to transition them between different grass hays, other than the fact that they may or may not like it. So you should be fine. But when it comes to fescue, and I'll get in on this, you know, fescue gets a really bad name, but that's what we have to pretty much graze. That's the only real grazing forage we have in Tennessee. But when you start talking about fescue hay and orchard grass hay and even Timothy, which is it's a really great horse hay, just it doesn't grow down here, period. And orchard grass is very difficult. Well, big difference is just that timing of when it's at its right peak stage to be baled. So obviously during the springtime, we get a lot of rain. And so it's hard to necessarily nail that right time because either our jobs get in the way, the rain gets away, something gets away. So fescue has the smallest window when you actually can get after it before it starts to transition from being like a reproductive growth, which is where it's producing a seed head, and vegetative, which is where we like to produce it. So it's a very small window. Orchard grass has a little bit larger window, and Timothy has even a little bit larger window. So nutritionally, they're all the same almost, right at it. You're gonna get the same protein, a lot of same energy. If you get them all done at the right time, nutritionally they're all the same. Is there a little, taste difference? Yeah, maybe there is, because they like Timothy pretty well, and they really like orchard grass pretty well. They're just really hard for us to grow down here. Even if you have a pure orchard grass hay field here, it's not going to last very long when we start getting into it. So, and we'll get into that. I don't want to get too far off bases, but when we start talking about it, as far as this system goes, he doesn't know the difference between a high quality orchard grass hay, a high quality fescue hay, high quality Timothy hay. If it's high quality, it's high quality, and cool season. This system doesn't know that. The microbes don't know that it tastes any different. So they're going to work through it. The alfalfa is going to work through it. So the big difference is it provides a lot of nutrients that some of these others don't. So either way, it's in here for 2 to 3 days. The microbes break it down. They created a new product. They're going to package, and it comes back up T-junction, and it's going to come back down to this little bit larger system. So, like I said, from the cecum on back, we are now what we call non-ruminant herbivores. Okay, so now we're trying to act like pretend we're a cow, but we're not a cow. So it comes down through here into the large intestine, and this is where those products that the microbes have created and have packaged are starting to come back down through here, and they come into the large intestine. So they're starting to be absorbed. The big thing here that also occurs, and we get all of our big B vitamins and other things occur here, we get water reabsorption. That's why it's key for horses to drink lots of water, whether it's through, like in the spring, you may not see them drink near as much water because they're getting a lot of it from that really nutrient-rich, that plant, that grass fescue plant that's growing, has got a lot of water in it. So they don't need as much water, but that's why they need a lot of water, because that is how the system is moving. It's moving it because it's got lots of water, lots of fluid is moving. So it's reabsorbed, and it's shipped, and it's used back down there at the very beginning. It's creating saliva. When they start to eat things, it creates the saliva, moves it back down here, gets to here, reabsorbed, and back down again. So water is extremely key, is that they have access to high quality water, because the whole system starts to shut down. That's where you start to get compaction. When you start to get issues with some of the systems starting to bog down, getting stuck, that's where you start to get compaction. You can start to see that with Bermuda grass. So a lot of times if we've got a horse that doesn't want, that we want to feed kind of a lower sugar diet, have less starches in the diet. And so we don't want it to have as high sugar content. So a popular feed is to feed Bermuda grass hay. If you look at Bermuda grass, it's very wispy. It's very thin compared to fescue. It doesn't need as much water, doesn't have as much leaf content, but it does have less sugar content. Problem is, if you look at that stuff, you can bind that stuff up and get it kind of in a ball. And so sometimes it's very difficult for some of that to pass through if it's not a good quality one. If you fed one that's really, really kind of stemmy and it balls up there, that's where you can sometimes get some of those compactions and get some of that blockage. The whole key is to keep that system moving all the time. So you keep good quality water in them, so letting them have all the water they need to keep that system flowing, not only keep it flowing, but also to keep them producing saliva to keep that stomach balanced. So as we start to come down towards the end, the last few feet, we're working our way through the large colon, and we start to move out the last few feet. We've got the small colon, and the small colon really becomes really key in the formation of the manure. So start to form that and then passing it on out. So if you look at this, when I stretch it out, that is the entire system. And so Kai, would you mind bringing our blanket over here? So we're going to bring a blanket over here, and so this blanket we produced. We brought a life-size looking horse, a mannequin, and we had some people, actually some kids, draw this, and so when they put it on here, so if you guys want to come up here.
No. You want me?
All right. So this is pretty close to the size. This blanket was on it, would be about I think probably an 800-pound horse, probably like an Arabian type horse. And so this is pretty close to the size of how all of this system right here is formed into the horse's body. So you took that entire system, I stretched it out. So it's real easy for water, if I start pouring water in down there, to make its way in a straight line down through this system. But now all of a sudden I've taken a blanket this size and I have jumbled this up. I would challenge anybody to be able to coil that hose up in one nice little coil. So if anybody wants to take that challenge, be able to do that and get it back in that trash can. But that's the reason why we start to get issues, is you start to get some of these things, okay? You start to get where the cecum is right here. You start to get where the cecum's right here, and you get some violent action or something, and you get something that twists around and gets, never heard of twisted gut? So you get some of these things that are occurring because it's just laying in there. And so things start to occur, you get twisted gut, and so you've cut off a point. So we can't get flow to it. You know, you've got your small intestine that's 70 feet piled here. And what are the odds that at some point when you're out there watering the garden that you get a kinked hose? It happens invariably. You know, some hoses are better than other hoses, right? So that's where, you know, that's where we have the issue. So that's why there's so many different points to the system that it's always a challenge. Some of them you can't control. But having an understanding of how the system works, well, so having a system, let her join in. So understanding how the system works will allow you to be able to understand that whenever you start to see a transition, whenever you start to add a new feed, how this is going to play a role in it. So anybody have any questions?
Any questions here? There is a question online. Somebody asked, they didn't fully hear, how long would you recommend starting a horse on grain that's never been on grain before? Like, would you just over weeks or?
A week to 2 weeks, just small amounts. If you're going to add, you know, a couple pounds to the diet, just, you know, handfuls at a time until you start to get it. But I don't measure anything in coffee cans. If I do, it's because I've waited beforehand, you know. But I grew up with coffee cans. I don't know, do they even make coffee cans anymore?
Yes, I still use some coffee cans.
It's plastic if not. But, you know, everybody grows up with coffee cans. You know, you walk into the feed store. So when you walk into the feed store and say, okay, you know, this is my problem. How much should I feed? Well, how much you feed? Well, I'm feeding one coffee can. Like I said, is the big gulp coffee, I mean, is it 64-ounce coffee can, or is it the little tiny little Folgers coffee can? So talk in pounds, because that's how your horse's body, you know, is measuring things. So when we talk about how much should the horse eat, we would say a minimum of 1% of its body weight should be in forage. I'd say you're going to run into problems if you're at a minimum of 1%. That's for a few select horses. You know, for most horses, 2 to 2.5% of their body weight, maybe 1.5, but 2% is a good guess. 2% of their body weight should be from a good quality forage. Well, you know, kind of do the math on that, and that's a lot of hay every day. So, you know, be thinking about that when you're starting to produce it. So don't feed it in a flake. You know, flake is not a weight of measurement. So, you know, figure out how much does that flake weigh. You know, how much are they going to be then eating based on that? When you start to talk to Dr. Ivy about nutrition, and we start to talk about some of your forage analysis, you know, give them weights. She's going to want to know weights, not coffee cans, but weights. So get yourself a good scale. Know how much you're actually going to put in that coffee can. You can certainly feed the coffee can, but no, because you need to know how much to transition. So whatever it is, the first time horse, it's going to be very small amounts. You're not going to ramp up to 5 pounds. You're going to start very, very small and then break that over a week to 2 weeks, spraying it out. Yes.
So when you go to feed, say, 1 to 2 plates of hay, is it better for their digestion if you give it to them as it's compacted out of a bale that it would take them longer to consume, or should they be pulled apart and fluffed back in?
You know, it doesn't really matter on that. No, keeping it as the flake. I'm realistic. You can say you should pull it apart and do all this stuff, but you know, you're going to go out there, you're going to throw the hay, you're going to throw the flake in the bag and let it warm.
Do they tend to eat it faster or slower, do you think?
You know, one thing about horses that we struggle with sometimes, and we do the same thing with dogs or anything else like that. We try to put our perspective on them. You know what? It's snowing outside. I'm wearing a coat. They should wear a coat. Okay? So, you know, I like salmon, so my dog should like salmon, you know, things like that. So we need to put, when we put our perspective on the hay is, they will self-limit and control it. If we allow them, if we provide what they need, they will control what they need. So provide the hay that they need, and they will pull it out and consume it as they need it.
How do you calculate how much they weigh?
So they sometimes use a heart girth tape. And so that's a calculation, a very simple calculation, but there is a tape that you'll measure the heart girth of the animal, and that gives you a pretty rough guess. I mean, it's actually pretty accurate. The other thing is you can run your, right up here we have truck scales. You run your trailer across, empty, you put the horse in it, you run back across, and there's your difference. So, yes.
What are some of the other events that trigger the killing of the microbes? I know you talked about Winston and digestive, but what are some of the other factors?
You can get in trouble. That's usually the biggest thing when it comes into that, when changing the chemistry of them.
Hey, Matt, will you repeat that?
Okay, the question is, what are some other events that cause changing or killing of the microbes in the cecum? Often, it's really just changing the chemistry of them. That's the biggest difference. Now, how that changes, is the biggest deal, whether it's lack of water, if they don't have all the nutrients, if you don't stop feeding them, if you just feed them a bunch of straw all the time, they're not going to produce near as much, so they're going to die off, and they're not producing what the horse needs, so that's where you start getting it. It's changing the chemistry of them. Yes?
Say you've got a horse that's being stalled for one reason or another, is it better just to dump their hay in there and let them have it, or would it be better to put it like in a slow feed bag if they're going to be in their stall for?
And that's kind of like, you kind of go the same thing back to humans, is kind of knowing your horse. Some of it, some of them will just kind of eat a little bit pace throughout the day. Others will try to consume as much as you put in there. So if you'll put in there a bale, the next day they'll go, if I eat this one bale, maybe they'll put in 2 bales. And so they just keep consuming all that you have. So you really, each horse is different, no matter. And I kind of go back to, yes, their bodies will control, but they will consume what they need. That doesn't mean they won't consume more than what they need, but their bodies will tell them to consume what they need. They're not going to starve themselves for the sake of starving themselves. But yes, they will. If you have a horse that just likes to eat, you may have to slow that process down, because as long as they're consuming something, they're producing the saliva. It's triggering that system, and they've got things in their system along the way. Thank you.
I have a question. Well, a comment I wanted you to elaborate on with the cecum in the wintertime, the importance of keeping hay, pumping through them, because that generates so much heat from the inside out.
Yes.
So that's what, whenever we mentioned that, oh, it's cold out, so I'm going to put a coat on my horse. It's like, really the best thing you can do is put hay in front of them so that they can generate their own heat from within. Right? Am I right about that?
And the same really applies to a lot of us. But what the action is, when you actually have the cecum is production is actually occurring. It's like a factory. A lot of people call the cecum and the rumen like a factory. Production is occurring. These animals are actively breaking down things, which is causing the buildup of heat. That's why that's why they may not want to eat as much during the summer, is because when you break down something, you're causing heat to build up. Well, during the summer, you don't want that heat. You're trying to dissipate out that heat. During the winter, you feed them high quality, because if it's not a high quality forage, let's say you're feeding them the barley or the straw, they're working, but they're not producing anything. So you're not getting a lot of that heat production. So they actually need to the actual breakdown of materials is what's causing that heat buildup. So you want to give them that high quality forage, so they're breaking it down, causing that heat production. And they need more nutrients during the winter, because guess what? They're not just trying to maintain, now they're trying to actually maintain and stay warm. And so that's a nutrition thing on down the line. So you start to get in all these other factors. So what does an animal need just to stay, alive? What does an animal need to stay alive and warm? What does an animal need to stay alive, warm, grow? What does an animal needs to stay live, warm, grow, and have a foal. And so it just depends on the stage of life, where they're at, and how much you need to do it. But yes, during the winter, it's a fermentation that it's production, it's making a lot of energy. So you really need to have a high quality forage to keep that functioning and keep that creating that warm vat. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned how long the transit was. How about from the cecum on, like the large?
So once it leaves the cecum, that's 2 to 3 days in general, and then after that, it's very rapid through the system. It's absorbed and then right out the system very, very quickly. So hours. So this is the big holding point. It gets down here. From there to there, it's very quick.
Is it the hydrochloric acid that pushes the food through? Does it fill up and push it through, or is it muscles?
So they have muscles. So the hydrochloric acid really stays just in the stomach for the most part. That's you get into leak. If you get leakages, that's where those valves that leak. But that's what they're there. They're there to keep that stuff in there at the bottom of that vat. When you get splash up effect, that's when it starts to splash out. But no, it's the muscles and the water that are pushing that ingested down.
The question she had about what could make that stop working, is that you got a horse that's wormy?
Yeah, anything, yeah. I mean, you can get into that, anything where you start to, you start to back up things, anywhere you start to back it up. So even if I, have a problem right here, it just starts backing all the way up, and so that's where then you get an issue somewhere 40 feet down the line is where you have a backup. So that's the bad part of that. So yes, that's why you worm. That's why you have to keep that system flowing all the time. Well, I hope so. Next week you're going to part of this will be review. Next week they're going to get into kind of the anatomy of it. But sometimes it helps, for me at least, I'm a very visual learner. That's why we're sitting in here today versus trying to do it at home. It's very hard to lay it out and say, here's the digestive system. So you're going to talk about each one of these stages. But here you can kind of see now why that system works the way it does, why we have two distinct parts of it, why we have to kind of feed them a little bit different. We can't just feed them like a cow and all dumps into one thing and then spray it, or feed them like a human. But things to be aware of, the way they occur, the physiology, the way they occur along the way. So when you guys are making those decisions on your farm, you feel confident in them because you know the reason why you're making it versus just, somebody told me to do this. I feel a lot more confident by decisions I make when I understand it versus somebody just told me to do this. Some bad rumors get started. So it keeps me employed though, so keep it up. All right, well.
I think we're good here. Wait.
Okay.
Can you tell by the poop if there are problems? That's the question.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Part of it I can tell what they're eating, but obviously they've got a sphincter down here that's helping form the balls. So if I've got loose stools, it means that I don't have a lot of fiber.
I'm getting closer so they can
I
hear
don't
you better.
have a lot of fiber in the cecum, so that might be an indicator it's early spring. Grass is very lush. I've got a lot of water in it. I've got less cell wall, so it's breaking down very rapidly, and it's working its way through the system very quickly, and it doesn't have enough fiber to get those nice dry road apples. Others, you get some of those the manure that's really just dry and just falls apart. They don't have enough water in their system. You will have an issue. I don't last for so long. You will have issues that can back up from that. So you don't want one that's real dry. I mean, you want one that if you squeeze it real hard, that you can get a little bit of moisture out of it. You don't want it to crumble, and you don't want it to run through your hands, but you should be able to squeeze it and pull some moisture out of it to know that that's the ideal manure.
I think that's it.
All right, well, great. Well, thank you guys. I hope you really enjoy it. I hope it helps over the next 2 weeks with nutrition. gives you a little bit better understanding. Obviously, it's not the end all be all for it, but when we go with the nutrition and the forage in a couple of weeks, it'll really help. And when you guys have questions from there on out, we can discuss each and every one of those. So, thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you, Matt.